Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It happened years ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was 24, working long shifts at a warehouse just outside of town. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My routine was simple: wake up, work, head home, and repeat. I lived alone in a small rental house near the outskirts, a quiet place surrounded by dense woods. At night, the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional car passing by on the lonely road that led to my driveway. The town itself was nothing special. A handful of gas stations, a diner that closed too early, and a main street that always felt abandoned after dark. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where strangers stuck out immediately. I had grown up here, but after high school, most of my friends had moved away. I stayed behind, mostly out of convenience. My job was steady, my rent was cheap, and I had never been the type to seek out excitement. That night, I had just finished another late shift. It was past 1 a.m., and the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath as I stepped out of the warehouse and walked toward my car. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few other cars belonging to the night crew. The orange glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, making everything feel eerily still. I climbed into my car, turned on the heat, and pulled onto the main road. It was a long, winding stretch of asphalt cutting through miles of forest. No traffic lights, no houses, just trees on either side. My house was about 20 minutes away, and I had driven this route so many times I could probably do it with my eyes closed. As I drove, I settled into my usual routine: radio off, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. The hum of the engine and the occasional flash of my headlights against the tree line were the only things breaking the silence. I wasn't tired, but there was something about driving alone at night that always put me in a weird headspace. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a broken tree branch or a mailbox. But as I got closer, I saw it clearly. A person standing completely still, facing the road. I slowed down slightly, my headlights illuminating them. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, hands at his sides. His face was just barely visible, pale and expressionless. Something about the way he stood sent a chill down my spine. Most people, if they were stuck out here, would try to wave down a car, maybe signal for help. But this guy? He didn't move. He didn't even look at me. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, an instinctual discomfort I couldn't shake. As I passed, I caught one last glimpse of his face, blank, unmoving. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind me. I shook it off. Maybe he was just some hitchhiker or someone whose car had broken down. Still, something about the encounter didn't sit right with me. I glanced at my rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, no sign of him. It was like he had never been there at all. I exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel tighter. Just keep driving, I told myself. You're almost home. But that was only the beginning, because a few miles down the road, I saw him again. And this time, he wasn't alone. The road stretched on, dark and quiet, with nothing but the occasional flicker of my headlights against the trees. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, a dull unease settling in my chest. I knew I had just passed that man. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Yet, there he was. The same dark clothes, the same motionless stance, the same pale face, barely visible in the glow of my headlights. I slowed down again, my heartbeat picking up. My first thought was that I was imagining things, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after a long shift. But no, he was real. I could see the way the light hit his clothes, the subtle way the wind moved his hair. I drove past him, refusing to make eye contact this time. My skin crawled as I kept my focus on the road ahead. The second I passed, I glanced at my rearview mirror. Nothing. My stomach tightened. He should have been there. The road was long and straight. If someone was standing by the side just moments ago, they wouldn't just disappear. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't normal. I pressed down on the gas pedal slightly, eager to put more distance between me and whatever I had just seen. The night felt colder somehow, the air inside my car heavy. I tried to shake the feeling, to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence. Maybe the first guy had a twin, or maybe there were just two different people wearing similar clothes. It was strange, but not impossible. I turned up the heat in the car, rubbing at my arms, though the chill I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. A few minutes passed, and then I saw them. 3 figures this time, standing in a row, just off the shoulder of the road. I slammed on the brakes before I could stop myself. My car skidded slightly, the tires screeching against the pavement. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared through the windshield. They stood completely still, just like the man before. No movement, no gestures, no expressions. 3 figures, 3 pairs of eyes locked on the road ahead, as if waiting for something. I felt my breath hitch. Something was wrong, deeply, deeply wrong. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked the screen. I had no idea who I was going to call. The police? What would I even say? Yeah, hi, there are some weird people standing on the side of the road, and I don't know how they got here. No, that sounded ridiculous. But my gut was screaming at me. Something wasn't right. I glanced back up, and I swear to God, they had moved. Not a lot, just barely. But I knew they weren't standing in the same exact positions as before. One of them was closer. I felt a sharp, electric jolt of fear run through me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some prank. I slammed my foot on the gas, my car lurching forward as the tires spun against the asphalt. I sped past them, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look in my mirrors, refusing to check if they were still there. I didn't want to know. I just needed to get home. Minutes passed, but I couldn't stop shaking. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I had never seen anyone out here at this time of night before. And even if I had, how had they gotten ahead of me? My house was still a few miles away. I gritted my teeth, forcing my focus onto the road. Almost there. Just a little farther. Then my headlights caught something. A shape. A person. Standing directly in the middle of the road. I barely had time to react. I yanked the wheel to the right, my tires screeching as the car veered off the pavement. My stomach lurched as the vehicle hit the dirt shoulder, bouncing violently before coming to a sudden, jarring stop. My breathing was ragged. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the steering wheel. Slowly, I turned my head toward the road. But there was no one there. No figures. No movement. Nothing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a trick of the light. Something was out here with me, and I had no idea what it wanted. My car sat at an awkward angle on the dirt shoulder, headlights still beaming onto the empty road ahead. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, my breaths coming out sharp and uneven. I scanned the area, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. But there was nothing. Nothing. No figures. No footsteps. No sign that anything had been standing in the middle of the road just seconds ago. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take slow, deep breaths. My chest was tight, my entire body tense with something I couldn't explain. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to keep driving and not look back. But my mind refused to let it go. I had seen someone. I had almost hit someone. And now they were just gone. I reached for my phone again, my fingers clumsy as I pulled up the dial pad. But as I stared at the screen, my mind raced through every possible scenario. What was I even going to say? If I called the police, what would I tell them? That I saw a group of people on the side of the road, that they somehow moved faster than any normal person should be able to, that one of them had been standing right in front of my car and then vanished. I already knew how that conversation would go. They'd ask if I had been drinking, if I was sleep deprived. They'd tell me it was probably nothing, that it was late and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew what I saw. I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. I exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel tighter. My car was still running, engine humming low beneath the pounding of my pulse. I forced myself to shift into reverse, easing my way back onto the road. My tires crunched against the gravel before finding pavement again. The moment I was back on the main road, I sped up. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I needed to get home. The trees flew past me in a blur, my headlights stretching far ahead into the empty darkness. The night felt heavier now, the air thick with something I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, like the world had gone completely still, like something was watching me from just beyond the tree line. I kept my hands locked on the wheel, knuckles white. The road twisted through the woods, long and endless. I glanced at my dashboard, just a few more miles. I could make it. Then, a shadow moved across my peripheral vision. I whipped my head to the left, heart hammering. Something was running alongside my car. I barely caught a glimpse of it, a dark figure, moving impossibly fast through the trees. The way it ran wasn't normal. Its movements were too smooth, too effortless, as if it wasn't bound by the same physical limits as everything else. I hit the gas, pushing the car faster. The speedometer climbed, my tires gripping the asphalt, but the figure kept up. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a body, moving through the forest at an inhuman speed. I clenched my teeth, gripping the wheel so hard my arms ached. The road curved ahead, and for a brief second, I lost sight of it. But then, a hand slammed against my driver's side window. I yelled, jerking the wheel to the right. My car swerved, the tires skidding against the pavement before I managed to regain control. My chest was heaving, my breathing erratic. I didn't look. I couldn't. I kept my focus locked on the road, pushing my car as fast as it could go. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. I drove the rest of the way home in silence. No figures. No movement. Nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the dull hum of my tires against the road. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my entire body numb. My house was dark, the porch light barely illuminating the front door. I forced myself to move, to step out into the night. The second my foot hit the ground, a wave of paranoia crashed over me. My eyes darted toward the trees surrounding my property, scanning for any sign of movement. Silence! I slammed my car door shut, practically running to my front door. My keys fumbled in my hands as I unlocked it, my breathing quick and uneven. The second I was inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checking it twice. Then I stood there, in the dark, listening. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The yellow glow flooded the small living room, casting long shadows against the walls. Everything looked normal. My couch, my TV, the small dining table tucked into the corner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved toward the windows, my fingers twitching as I pulled the blinds down. I didn't want to see outside. I didn't want to know if anything was out there. Because deep down, I already knew. I swallowed, running a shaky hand down my face. I needed to calm down. I needed to think. I walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. The sound of the tap running filled the room, grounding me for a brief moment. I took a long sip, closing my eyes, forcing my body to relax. It was just the road, I told myself. Just shadows. Just a long shift messing with my head. But then, a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. I froze, my grip tightening around the glass. The knock wasn't loud. It wasn't hurried. Just a single, slow tap against the wood. I turned my head toward the front door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Another knock. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The air in the room felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't explain. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared at the door, every muscle in my body locking up. Then, the doorknob turned. I dropped the glass. It shattered against the floor, but I barely heard it. My entire body was frozen in place as I watched the knob rattle, twisting slowly, deliberately. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stood there, my mind screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. And then, just like that, it stopped. The room was silent again. The doorknob was still. My entire body was shaking, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I took a slow, trembling step backward, my legs unsteady beneath me. Then I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the wall, my breathing erratic. And outside, in the silent, suffocating darkness, something was waiting. I sat in my room, my back pressed against the locked door, every muscle in my body rigid. My breaths were shallow, uneven, and the silence outside my door was deafening. The only sound was the frantic beating of my heart, a rapid thud that seemed loud enough to give me away. Had it left? Had it ever been there in the first place? I tried to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, that exhaustion was warping my perception. But the sound of that doorknob twisting, the slow, deliberate knocks, the figure running alongside my car, those weren't tricks of the imagination. They were real. Something was outside my house, and it wanted to get in. I reached for my phone with a shaking hand, my fingers fumbling as I unlocked it. My screen glowed in the dim room, casting eerie shadows against the walls. My thumb hovered over the emergency call button. Then, the doorknob to my bedroom moved. I stopped breathing. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the room as the handle twisted, testing the lock. The door didn't budge, but the pressure was there, slow and intentional. My chest clenched so tight it hurt. I gripped my phone with both hands, trying to steady myself, trying to force my mind to work through the sheer panic gripping my body. Another click. The lock held. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, willing whoever or whatever was on the other side to go away. Then, a soft, almost inhuman sigh came from the other side of the door. Low, breathless. A sound that shouldn't have been possible. My entire body tensed. My stomach twisted into knots so tight I thought I might be sick. I barely even registered that my hand had moved on its own, that I had pressed the call button. The ringing felt painfully slow. Pick up. Please, pick up. Then, 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice nearly made me jump. I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to form words, but my throat was locked up, my mind racing. Another knock, this time harder. I forced my voice out, barely above a whisper. "There's someone in my house." The knocking stopped. The line crackled as the operator's voice remained calm. "Can you confirm your address?" I gave it to them as quickly as I could, my words stumbling over themselves. "Stay on the line," they said. "Units are on their way. You have a safe place to hide?" I swallowed, my mouth dry. I didn't. There was nowhere in my room that would protect me if the lock gave out. The closet? Too obvious. Under the bed? Useless. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely holding together. Then, the operator asked something that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. "Do you know if they're still inside?" I stared at the door. The knob wasn't moving anymore. The room was silent. I didn't know. My voice was shaking now. Then, a loud bang from the other side of the door. I yelped, scrambling backward. The wood shook as something slammed against it with terrifying force. "Stay on the line," the operator said again, their voice still level. "Officers are 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. Another bang. The door frame creaked, the lock rattling. Something was trying to break in. I pressed myself into the farthest corner of my room, the phone gripped so tightly in my hand that my fingers ached. Then, silence. No knocking, no slamming, just nothing. The sudden lack of sound made my skin crawl even more. I barely breathed. The operator was still speaking, but I wasn't listening anymore. My focus was entirely on the door, on the absence of movement. Something was wrong. Then, the lock clicked. It unlocked. My breath hitched. That wasn't possible. I hadn't moved. I hadn't touched it. I watched in horror as the knob slowly turned. The door swung open. And standing there was nothing. The hallway was empty. My stomach dropped. I didn't move, didn't blink. I knew something had been there. I had heard it, and now it was gone. I forced myself to move, inching forward on shaky legs. My breath trembled as I peeked into the hallway. Darkness stretched out in both directions. The front door was still locked. The windows were still shut. Nothing. Nothing at all. But then, my eyes landed on the floor near my bedroom doorway, and my blood ran cold. There were footprints. Bare, wet footprints. Leading away from my door. Leading into the darkness of my house. A distant siren wailed in the night. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then, a soft breath right behind me, and the lights went out. The darkness swallowed everything. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in place, my body unwilling, unable to move. The only sound was the blood rushing through my ears, a deafening pulse that drowned out everything else. I strained my senses, desperate to hear something. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But there was nothing. Nothing but silence. Then, a whisper, right behind me. Not words, not a voice, just breath. My body acted before my mind could catch up. I lunged forward, nearly tripping over my own feet, my hands slamming against the wall as I fumbled for the light switch. My fingers trembled as I flipped it up and down, desperate to chase away the suffocating darkness. Nothing. The power was out. I turned my head toward the hallway, expecting to see something. A shadow. A figure. Anything to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. But the hallway was still empty, except for the footprints. My stomach twisted at the sight of them. Still wet, still fresh, leading away from my room. But they didn't continue down the hall. They stopped. right outside the closet. The air left my lungs all at once. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to think. The sirens were closer now. If I could just hold on a little longer. A creak. The closet door moved. I ran. My body wasn't waiting for a plan. My survival instincts took over, and I sprinted down the hallway, nearly slamming into the front door. My hands fumbled with the locks, ripping them open so fast my fingers slipped. I didn't care. I yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. The distant flashing of red and blue lights pierced the darkness, and I ran straight toward them. I didn't stop. Not until I was safely behind the officers. Not until I was surrounded by something real. Not until I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I must have looked like a complete wreck. My breath was still ragged, my body shaking so violently that even the officer standing in front of me placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. Are you hurt? His voice was calm, controlled. I shook my head, swallowing hard. No, I managed. He studied me for a moment before glancing toward the house. Did you see someone inside? I opened my mouth to answer, then hesitated. Did I? I had seen footprints, heard breathing, felt something in the darkness. But had I actually seen anything? I couldn't say. The officer motioned for his partner, and within moments, they were clearing the house. I stood outside, arms wrapped tightly around myself as I watched the beams of their flashlights sweep through the windows. It felt like forever before one of them stepped back onto the porch. Nobody's inside, he said. I stared at him. What? My voice barely came out. The officer shook his head. We checked every room. Every door was locked. No forced entry. Nothing's been disturbed. He frowned slightly. You're sure you heard someone? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I had heard something. I had seen something. The footprints. My body was ice cold. I turned my head slowly, my eyes searching the ground. But the footprints, they were gone. I took a slow step forward, my pulse hammering. No, I whispered, more to myself than to the officers. They were right here. I stopped. There was nothing. Just dry pavement. No prints. No water. No proof. The officer must have noticed my reaction because he let out a slow breath. You've had a rough night, he said carefully. Is there anyone we can call for you? I shook my head. I barely heard what else he said. My thoughts were still trapped in the house, still locked in that moment when the door opened, when the lights went out, when I felt something breathing behind me. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. But now, standing here in the safety of the street, with flashing police lights reflecting off my windows, it was like it had never happened. But I knew better. Something had been there, and it wasn't gone. It just didn't need footprints anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the officers left, even after I triple-checked the locks and shut every door, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every shadow stretched too long. Every creak in the house felt deliberate. Even my own reflection in the darkened windows seemed off, like it wasn't quite me. The logical part of my brain tried to make sense of everything. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the stress of the night had twisted my senses, made me see things that weren't really there. But the other part of me, the one that had stood frozen in my hallway, too terrified to move, knew the truth. Something had been in my house. Something had followed me. And worst of all, it was still here. I stayed in the living room until the first traces of dawn crept through the blinds. Only then did the overwhelming weight of exhaustion settle in, my body finally demanding rest. But even as I closed my eyes, the memories of the night lingered, playing over and over like a broken record. The footprints, the closet door, the breath on my neck. When I finally drifted off, my sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares I couldn't remember when I woke up. But one thing stuck with me. I never heard the front door open that night, even when I ran, even when I fled the house in pure terror. I had unlocked it, but I never heard it open. So how did whatever was inside leave? Or worse, had it ever left at all? I moved out a week later. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I made up an excuse about finding a better place, something closer to work, something with better utilities. No one questioned it, but I knew the truth. I had to leave, not because I thought I'd see it again, not because I thought it would hurt me, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in my house had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to understand. And I couldn't let that happen, because once you acknowledge something like that, it never lets you go. That was years ago. I don't tell many people this story, not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, most wouldn't, but because saying it out loud makes it real again. It brings back that night, the breath on my neck, the feeling of something unseen just out of reach. Even now, I catch myself thinking about it when I'm alone in a dark room, listening, waiting, because if I was wrong that night, if it never really left, it all started one summer when my friends and I found ourselves with too much time and too little to do. We had all grown up in the same small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and boredom comes as naturally as breathing. There were 5 of us that night. We weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers. We were just regular guys, looking for something to kill the time. That's how we ended up at St. Vincent's Hospital. The hospital had been abandoned for over 20 years, left to decay after a fire tore through the east wing. No one died in the fire, at least not officially, but the rumors told a different story. People claimed that some patients had been left behind in the chaos, that the staff had fled without evacuating everyone. Others whispered about the underground morgue, about bodies that had never been removed, left to rot beneath the hospital's foundations. But to us, it was just an old building, another relic of a town that had seen better days. The night was humid, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water. We had parked about half a mile away, leaving our cars behind to avoid drawing attention. The hospital sat at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and rusted chain-link fences. A single dirt path led up to the main entrance, a cracked and crumbling staircase that had long since been overtaken by weeds. We stood there for a while, staring up at the looming structure. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. Vines had begun to crawl up the walls, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. The only sound was the faint hum of insects in the distance, the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. "This is a bad idea," one of the guys muttered. "Come on, it's just an empty building," another replied, rolling his eyes. "Well, go in, take a look around, and be out in an hour." We climbed the steps, pushing open the rusted doors with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, crumbling plaster, remnants of a place that had once been filled with life. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. There was something unsettling about the silence. A place like this should have had some sound, dripping water, scurrying rats, the distant creak of settling wood. But there was nothing, just the sound of our own breathing, the soft crunch of our footsteps against the dust-covered floor. We moved deeper into the hospital, past empty rooms and overturned gurneys. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it crude, some of it unsettling. Words scrawled in red paint, phrases that didn't make sense. He never left. Don't look at the windows. They see you. It was all just graffiti, just the work of teenagers looking to scare whoever came after them. But still, it put us on edge. We found ourselves in what must have once been the main lobby. The reception desk was still there, though the wood had rotted through, and the computer monitors were smashed beyond recognition. A few chairs were overturned, their cushions torn and spilling yellowed foam onto the floor. "We should check out the third floor," someone suggested. "Why?" "That's where they kept the psychiatric patients." I didn't like the sound of that. It was one thing to explore an abandoned hospital, another thing entirely to walk through the rooms where people had been locked away, forgotten by the outside world. But I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to be the one to back out first. The stairwell was narrow, the steps covered in dirt and scattered papers. Some of the walls still had old notices pinned to them, reminders for staff meetings, patient schedules, handwritten notes scrawled in fading ink. As we climbed, the air grew heavier, thick with something I couldn't quite place. Not just dust or mildew, but something else. Something stale. We reached the third floor, stepping into a long hallway lined with doors. Some were open, revealing empty rooms with rusted bed frames and peeling wallpaper. Others were locked, their tiny observation windows clouded with grime. "This place is creepy as hell," one of the guys muttered. "Yeah," another agreed, shining his flashlight down the hall. "Let's take a quick look and head back." I nodded, but something about the air made my skin crawl. The hairs on my arms stood on end, an instinctive reaction to something I couldn't explain. Then we heard it. A sound, distant but clear. A shuffling. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from further down the hall. We froze. No one spoke. No one moved. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, the sound of bare feet against the dirty tile. There shouldn't have been anyone here. We weren't alone. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of our own breathing, sharp and uneven in the silence. Every muscle in my body tensed, my grip tightening around the flashlight as I scanned the hallway. The dust-covered floor was undisturbed. There were no signs of movement, no shifting shadows, no flicker of motion at the edges of my vision. "Did you hear that?" one of the guys whispered. I nodded slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Yeah, we stood there, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Just the quiet hum of the empty hospital pressing in around us. "Could they have been an animal?" someone suggested, though the doubt was clear in his voice. We all wanted to believe that it was just a raccoon or a stray cat, something small scurrying through the ruins of a forgotten building. But the footsteps had been too deliberate, too steady. Not the frantic, darting movements of a scavenging animal. They had been slow, methodical, like someone walking barefoot across the cold tile. "Let's just check the rooms real quick and head back," one of the guys muttered, shifting nervously. None of us wanted to admit how uneasy we felt. We weren't supposed to be scared. It was just an old hospital, dark, abandoned, crumbling, but nothing more. We pressed forward, moving past the empty rooms, peering inside as we went. The patient rooms were stripped bare, rusted bed frames, peeling wallpaper, shattered glass on the floor. Some rooms had old, yellowed papers scattered across the ground, medical charts with names long faded by time. But then we reached room 306. Unlike the others, this door was shut. The small rectangular window at eye level was covered in grime, but I could still make out something faint, a shadow, a shape just beyond the glass. My breath hitched. "There's something in there," I said, my voice lower than I intended. The others hesitated, then stepped closer, shining their flashlights at the window. The shadow didn't move. It stood there, motionless, just behind the glass. Someone cursed under their breath. "Is that a person? It can't be." My voice was barely above a whisper. It didn't make sense. No one else should have been in this hospital. The building was condemned, windows shattered, doors rusted shut. There was no way someone had just wandered in and decided to stand motionless in a locked room. "Try the door," one of the guys suggested. I hesitated, then slowly reached for the handle. The metal was cold, rusted, rough beneath my fingers. I turned it. Locked. A wave of relief washed over me. If the door was locked, then whatever was inside wasn't getting out. "Maybe it's just a piece of old furniture," someone muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "Yeah," I lied. "Probably." But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Furniture didn't stand like that. Didn't watch like that. We moved on, trying to shake the unease settling in our chests. The hallway stretched on, leading us deeper into the hospital. The walls were lined with old, rusting medical equipment, wheelchairs missing wheels, 4 stands covered in cobwebs, a defibrillator whose screen had long since been shattered. It was the kind of place that reeked of abandonment, of forgotten histories. Then we heard it, a slow, scraping sound. From behind us. I turned, shining my flashlight down the corridor. The door to room 306 was open. Wide open. A chill ran through me. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp and sudden weight pressing down on my chest. "Who opened it?" someone whispered. No one answered. We were the only ones here. The shadow that had been behind the glass was gone. The room itself was empty, just another abandoned patient room, identical to all the others. Nothing inside, nothing visible. But the air felt different, heavy, like something unseen had just passed through. One of the guys swallowed hard. "We should go." No one argued. We turned back, retracing our steps toward the stairwell. But then the lights flickered. For a split second, the hallway was plunged into complete darkness. It wasn't just the failing light of our flashlights. The entire hallway had gone dark. Then, just as quickly, the flickering stopped. The overhead lights, which had been dead for years, buzzed weakly to life, casting a sickly, flickering glow down the hall. A voice spoke, a whisper, from somewhere close. I couldn't make out the words. It was too faint, too warped, like a voice carried through water. But I knew one thing. It was right behind me. I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to shine my flashlight behind me and confirm what I already knew, that something was there, standing just inches away, whispering in a voice that no human should have. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The others must have felt it too, because no one spoke. No one so much as twitched. We stood frozen in that flickering hallway, caught in the kind of fear that slams into you so hard, shuts down every rational thought. Then the whispering stopped. Not in a fading, natural way, but like a sound being cut off mid-sentence, sharp, unnatural, wrong. And in that silence, something brushed against my back. I spun so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight, aiming the beam straight behind me. Nothing. Just empty hallway, the open door to room 306, and the cold, stale air pressing in on all sides. No one spoke. No one could. We needed to get out. That was the only thought I had left. Whatever curiosity had brought us here had been smothered under something much heavier, something watching, waiting, toying with us. One of the guys finally whispered, "We need to move." No one argued. We picked up the pace, moving toward the stairwell, but then something changed. The air itself. The hallway had been cold since Wet arrived, but this was different. A deep, bone-chilling cold that settled into my skin, seeping into my muscles like something unnatural was pressing against me. Then, the lights flickered again. Only this time, they stayed off. Total darkness. A heavy, suffocating void. I couldn't see my own hand in front of me. Couldn't see the others. Couldn't even tell if they were still there. Just that thick, inky blackness. Then, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from somewhere down the hall. Then another. Footsteps. Not the careful, hesitant steps we'd heard before. These were running. Fast. Hard. Coming straight for us. I scrambled for my flashlight, my fingers numb and shaking as I flicked the switch. The beam cut through the dark just as the footsteps stopped. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. But something was different. The hallway had changed. I didn't notice it at first, but as my pulse slowed just enough for my brain to start working again, the realization hit me like ice water. The layout was wrong. The hallway had been long and straight when we'd walked down it, with the stairwell at the end leading back to the first floor. But now, the stairwell was gone. In its place was another stretch of hallway, identical to the one we had just walked through. Same peeling paint, same broken equipment, same endless rows of doors leading to dark, empty rooms. One of the guys whispered, "Where's the stairs?" No one answered. We started walking again, faster this time, flashlights swinging wildly as we tried to find a way out. Every hallway looked the same. The layout wasn't just wrong, it was changing, twisting, leading us deeper. At some point, the panic set in. I could hear it in our breathing, feel it in the way we barely spoke now, just moving forward in desperate silence. And then, a door slammed shut behind us, hard enough to shake the walls. Someone cursed under their breath. We turned, shining our flashlights back, but the door was just there, shut. It hadn't been closed before. I knew it hadn't. Then, a sound, faint, from the other side of the door. Breathing. Slow, raspy, deep. A hand reached for the handle. "No," I whispered, but it was too late. The door burst open. For a split second, the light of our flashlights caught something. A figure, too tall, too thin, too wrong, standing in the doorway. Then, the lights went out again, and all I could hear was running. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. My body just moved. I could hear the others sprinting beside me, their footsteps hammering against the rotting hospital floor. The beams of our flashlights swung wildly, barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The hallway stretched endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Behind us, the footsteps. Faster, heavier, closer. Whatever had come through that door wasn't just following us. It was chasing us. Someone screamed. I don't even know who. Maybe it was me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop. Didn't dare look back. The hallway took another sharp turn, and suddenly we were in a different part of the hospital. I knew because the air changed again, thicker, suffocating, reeking of something foul. The walls were different too, not peeling paint anymore, but stained. Dark, spreading patches seeped across them like something had soaked into the very foundation. The floor beneath us felt softer somehow, and the moment that realization hit, my stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Then, a voice. Low, garbled, inhuman. It came from everywhere at once. I stopped running. So did the others. Not because we wanted to, but because we had to. Something was standing at the end of the hall. A shape. Tall. Unnaturally tall. Its limbs were stretched too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows clung to it like it was part of them, like it was made from them. Then it moved. Not like a person. Like something wearing the idea of a person, but not quite understanding how it worked. Its head twitched first, then its shoulders, then its arms. Long, jagged fingers curled at its sides, and when it took its first step toward us, the entire hallway shuddered. The walls, the floors, the air. Everything trembled, as if the hospital itself was reacting to this thing's presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. And then, it spoke. Or at least, I think it did. The sound that came from its mouth wasn't like anything it ever heard before. It was wrong. A garbled mess of words, layered over each other, too fast, too slow, twisting and breaking apart before they could make sense. And yet, I understood. You don't belong here. The words slammed into me like a physical force. My knees buckled, my vision blurred. Then came the second voice. Behind me. I turned, and there it was. Another one. This one was closer. Close enough that I could see the way its skin shifted, pale and stretched too thin, like something had been stuffed inside it, something that didn't quite fit. And then, it smiled. The mouth stretched too wide, too many teeth. I took a step back. So did the others. The thing at the end of the hallway took a step forward. So did the one behind us. We were trapped. Panic clawed at my chest. My pulse pounded in my ears. There was no way out. No doors. No windows. Just them. Then, the lights flickered. For a split second, everything was normal. The hallway looked like it had when we first walked in. Dusty, broken, abandoned. But just as quickly, the light vanished again, and the things were closer. The second one was standing right behind me. So close, I could feel its breath. Cold, wet, rotten. A hand wrapped around my arm. Fingers, too many fingers. I screamed. The others did too. Then, the hospital shifted. A sound, like metal being ripped apart, tore through the air. The walls buckled. The floor cracked. The ceiling caved inward. And in the middle of it all, the things laughed. Not like people. Not like anything that should exist. Then, darkness. Silence! That was the first thing I noticed when I woke up. No distant echoes. No heavy footsteps. No ragged breathing behind me. Just an empty, suffocating silence. I was on the floor. My body ached. My head pounded. My arms felt like they had been stretched too far, like something had been holding on to them. Squeezing. I blinked. The world swayed. For a second, I thought I was still trapped in that nightmare, until my vision cleared, and I realized I was somewhere else. The hospital hallway was gone. Or rather, it was different. The flickering lights were steady now. The walls weren't dripping with shadows, weren't pulsing like something alive. The air still smelled stale and rotten, but it wasn't as thick, as suffocating. I heard a groan next to me. I turned my head. The others were there, lying across the cracked tile floor, looking just as disoriented as I felt. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Then, did that just happen? The words barely registered in my mind. My brain was still catching up, still trying to process the last thing I remembered. The things. The voices. The hospital tearing itself apart. But we were still here. Why? I pushed myself up, my limbs trembling beneath me. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, but it was dead. Useless. One of the others fumbled for their phone, pressing the power button frantically. The screen remained dark. "Shit," someone whispered. "How? How did we get here?" No one answered, because none of us knew. All I remembered was the moment everything collapsed. The shadows, the sound, the laughter. And then, nothing. But something wasn't right. I could feel it. The air was wrong. The hospital felt different, but not in a way that made sense. It was too still, too quiet. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to work. I reached out, shaking the person nearest to me. "Come on," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to leave. Now." They didn't argue. None of us wanted to stay. We moved as quickly as we could, stumbling down the hallway, our bodies weak, our minds still reeling from whatever had happened. The hospital should have been easy to navigate. We'd memorized the layout. We knew the way out. But as we walked, the corridors felt longer. The turns felt sharper. And then, after what felt like forever, we saw it. The entrance. The rusted double doors stood in front of us, just slightly ajar, allowing the faintest sliver of moonlight to spill inside. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. We ran. No hesitation. No looking back. Just as I reached the doors, I shoved against them with everything I had, expecting resistance. But they flew open. The cold night air hit my skin. And then, just like that, we were outside. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. It was still parked exactly where we left it, sitting beneath a flickering street lamp. I nearly sobbed at the sight of it. We piled inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. None of us spoke. No one wanted to be the first to ask the question we were all thinking. But eventually, someone did. What the hell happened back there? The words hung in the air. No one had an answer. We all remembered the same things, the shadowed figures, the distorted voices, the way reality itself had seemed to bend and break around us. But none of us remembered how we got out. None of us remembered what happened after the lights went out. I turned my gaze toward the hospital, my stomach twisting. The building stood exactly as it had before, silent, dark, abandoned, like nothing had happened at all. But just as I was about to look away, something moved. In the window, a shadow, standing perfectly still, watching us. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't say anything. Neither did the others. Because somehow, we all knew. The hospital wasn't empty. And whatever was inside, it had let us leave. But that didn't mean it was done with us. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The road stretched endlessly before us, headlights cutting through the thick silence. The occasional street lamp flickered past, casting fleeting shadows across our exhausted faces. I could see it in the others, the same unspoken understanding. Something had happened in that hospital. Something we weren't supposed to see. And we were lucky to be alive. The farther we got from that place, the less suffocating the air felt. But the weight in my chest didn't ease. Even as the city lights came back into view, even as the night felt normal again, the feeling remained. Like we hadn't actually left. Like something had followed us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark silhouette standing in the middle of the empty road, watching, waiting. But the road was clear. Empty. At least, that's what I told myself. We dropped everyone off, one by one. No one said much beyond a quiet, "See you later." But we all knew we wouldn't be seeing each other for a while. Some things change you. And this? This had changed us. By the time I got home, my body felt like it was moving on autopilot. I locked the door, double-checked it, then checked it again. Every creak of my apartment made my pulse jump. The distant hum of the fridge, the soft tick of the clock, sounds I'd never paid attention to before, suddenly felt too loud, too present. I went straight to the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, and then I noticed it. Dark marks wrapped around my wrist. Bruises, like fingers. My stomach twisted. I touched the skin, flinching at the tenderness. The last thing I remembered before we woke up on the floor was something grabbing me, holding me down. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to shake it off. It's over, I told myself. It's over. But as I turned off the bathroom light, stepping into the darkness of my room, the thought crept in. What if it's not? What if that place had taken something from us? Or worse, what if it had left something behind? I barely slept that night. And even now, I still wake up some nights feeling like there's something in the room with me. Watching. Waiting. I don't tell people about the hospital anymore. Not really. Not the truth. Because how do you explain something like that? How do you make someone understand what we saw? You don't. And maybe that's for the best. Because some places, they aren't abandoned. They're just waiting. It was late October, just before the cold set in. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. I had planned a weekend camping trip with 3 of my closest friends, guys I'd known since college. We'd done trips like this before, but this one felt different. Not because of anything specific, but because of where we were going. The spot we chose was deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites. One of my friends had read about it online, an old, abandoned campground that had been shut down years ago. There were no official reasons listed, just vague mentions of unforeseen circumstances. The location was remote, untouched for years, and that made it perfect. No tourists, no noisy campers. Just us and the wilderness. We packed our gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, enough firewood to last the weekend. We weren't amateurs, we knew what we were doing. The drive took nearly 4 hours, winding through back roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper we went. Cell service was gone long before we reached the trailhead, which only added to the feeling of isolation. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set. The sky burned in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the trees. The air had that eerie stillness that sometimes settles in just before nightfall. We parked the truck at the edge of the overgrown path and loaded up our backpacks, double-checking everything before heading in. The hike to the abandoned campsite wasn't long, maybe an hour at most. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a different kind of cold, the kind that settles in your bones no matter how many layers you wear. It made no sense. The forecast had been clear, and we weren't that high in elevation. But none of us mentioned it. Maybe we didn't want to admit it was strange. We reached the site just as darkness fully set in. The place was exactly as described, deserted, forgotten. There were remnants of old fire pits, rotted wooden benches half buried under leaves, and a few rusted metal poles that might have once been part of a structure. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. Still, we set up camp. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. We sat around, talking, laughing, roasting food over the flames. For a while, it felt normal, like any other trip. The unease faded into the background, replaced by the comfort of old friends and familiar routines. But as the night went on, something changed. The forest, once filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant calls of wildlife, grew unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears strain, waiting for something, anything, to break it. And then we heard it. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint sound buried beneath the crackling fire. Something shifting in the darkness, just beyond the light. That sound, at first, it was so quiet, I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. A faint shuffle, maybe just the wind moving through the underbrush. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. I glanced at my friends, expecting at least one of them to react, but no one said anything. They kept talking, their voices carrying through the silent forest like nothing was wrong. I hesitated, debating whether to say something, but I didn't want to be the guy who got spooked over nothing. Then it came again. A slow, deliberate movement. Not an animal scurrying, not the natural creaks of the forest settling. This was different. It had weight to it, like something shifting its position. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. One of my friends, let's call him Matt, paused mid-sentence, his eyes darting toward the trees. He heard it too. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. The conversation stopped. The four of us sat there, frozen, listening. The fire crackled, the flames casting erratic shadows on the trees. Nothing, just silence. "Probably a deer," another friend, let's call him Nate, said, shrugging it off. "Or a raccoon. We brought food, remember?" It was a logical explanation, but it didn't sit right with me. Deer and raccoons don't move like that. They're quick, darting in and out of the brush. This was slow, deliberate. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and fallen leaves. I swept it left, then right. Nothing. "See? Nothing there," Nate said, stretching his legs out like he wasn't the least bit concerned. "Relax, man." But Matt wasn't convinced. He reached for his own flashlight and stood next to me. "Something's out there," he muttered, just low enough that only I could hear. I nodded. "Yeah." We stood there for a moment longer, scanning the tree line. Still nothing. But the feeling remained. That nagging sense that something, someone, was watching. Eventually, we sat back down. The conversation picked up again, though a little less lively than before. I kept my ears tuned in, waiting for another sound, but for a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as I was starting to relax, the fire flickered. Not in the way a fire normally does. It dimmed, like something had blocked the air for just a second. The flames wavered unnaturally, casting shadows that stretched and twisted. Matt saw it too. He shifted uneasily. "Did you see that?" Nate rolled his eyes. "Dude, it's a fire. It does that." But the fire didn't just flicker, it dimmed again, this time for longer. Like something was moving in front of it. I turned, scanning the darkness. A part of me wanted to call out, to demand whoever was there to show themselves. But another part, the part that had gone completely cold, told me not to. And then the sound came again. Closer this time. Right at the edge of the light. A rustling, slow and deliberate. Matt grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the noise. The beam caught something, just for a fraction of a second. A shape. Low to the ground, unmoving. And then it was gone. He swore under his breath. "Did you see that?" I nodded. "Yeah." "What the hell was that?" Nate, now slightly less amused, sat up straighter. "What did you guys see?" "I don't know," Matt said. "But it wasn't a deer." For a moment, none of us spoke. Then the forest went silent again, so silent it felt unnatural. And that's when we heard the breathing. Not ours, not an animal's, something else. Low, steady, just beyond the firelight. The breathing was so faint at first that I wasn't sure if I was really hearing it or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. But as the seconds passed, it became clearer, slow, measured inhales and exhales, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. Matt gripped his flashlight tighter. "Did you hear that?" This time, no one dismissed it. Even Nate, who had been the most skeptical, looked uneasy. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't the short, quick breaths of a deer or the snuffling of a raccoon. It was human, steady, deliberate. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sharper than I intended. Silence. The only response was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, just as I started to convince myself that maybe the breathing had been in my head, we all heard it, something shifting. A single, deliberate step on dry leaves. Matt aimed his flashlight toward the trees. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and tangled branches. My own hand went to my flashlight, and I swept it in the opposite direction. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not old, scattered prints from hikers. These were fresh, so fresh that the dirt around them was still settling. And they weren't from any of us. "Guys," I whispered, my stomach nodding. "Come look at this." They joined me, their flashlights converging on the prints. There was something off about them. They weren't deep, meaning whoever left them wasn't heavy. But the spacing was strange, too far apart, like whatever had walked through here had been moving unnaturally fast. Nate exhaled sharply. "Okay, that's weird." Matt bent down, running a hand over one of the prints. "These weren't here earlier, and that was the part that chilled me the most. We'd been here for hours, and none of us had seen any tracks like this before. Maybe another camper passed through?" I offered, though I didn't believe it. Nate shook his head. "No way. We're in the middle of nowhere. If someone else was camping here, we would have seen their gear." I turned back to the trees, scanning the shadows. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. Then we heard another noise. This one was different, sharp, unnatural. A clicking sound, almost like fingernails tapping against wood. It came from above us. I tilted my head back, shining my flashlight into the branches. For a split second, I thought I saw something move. A shape just out of reach of the light. And then the fire flickered again. Harder this time. The flames bent unnaturally, as if an invisible force had pushed against them. The temperature dropped, not a gradual change, but sudden, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath came out in a visible puff. Matt cursed under his breath. "Screw this, man." He turned toward the tents, unzipping his and grabbing his knife from his pack. I wasn't sure what a knife would do against whatever this was, but it made me feel a little better knowing he had it. Nate, still trying to hold on to some sense of logic, ran a hand through his hair. "All right, let's not freak out. It's gotta be something explainable." I didn't respond, because deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Another sound, louder this time. Leaves crunching. It was coming closer. I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a step toward the noise. "If someone's messing with us," I called, "it's not funny." "Silence!" Then, movement. Not just from one direction, but all around us. The underbrush rustled, twigs snapped. It was like something, or multiple somethings, were closing in. Matt pulled his knife from its sheath. Nate grabbed a thick branch from the ground, holding it like a bat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The night was still again, the only sound the distant chirp of insects. The four of us stood there, waiting, barely breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then Nate let out a nervous chuckle. Okay, there was a scream, not from us. It came from the woods, high-pitched, raw, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Pain? Something worse? It was close, too close. And then we saw it, a shape just at the edge of the firelight. Tall, thin, unmoving, watching. The figure at the edge of the firelight didn't move. It stood there, motionless, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Matt tightened his grip on his knife, his knuckles white. Nate had gone completely still, his usual sarcasm nowhere to be found. None of us spoke. None of us breathed. We just stood there, locked in a silent battle with whatever this was. And then it took a step forward. The firelight caught it, just for a second. Pale skin, hollowed eyes, limbs too long, joints bending slightly in the wrong direction. My stomach turned. Every hair on my body stood on end. Then another step. It moved with a strange, unnatural grace, like it wasn't used to walking, but was trying to mimic the way humans did. The longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. Its proportions weren't quite right. Its head tilted slightly too far to one side. A sharp inhale from Matt broke the silence. What the hell? The thing moved. Not walked, not ran, just shifted. One moment, it was at the edge of the light. The next, it was closer. Too close. My flashlight trembled in my hands. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Its face, if I could even call it that, was distorted, as if someone had taken a human expression and stretched it just a little too far. And its eyes, completely black, weren't just looking at me. They were looking into me. Then, a sound. Not a growl, not a snarl. Something else. It was laughing. But it wasn't a real laugh. It was a mimicry. A hollow, empty attempt at something human. A sound that didn't belong here, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night. Matt snapped. He lunged forward, swinging his knife in a wild, desperate arc. The blade should have connected, should have met resistance, flesh, bone, something. But there was nothing. The thing was gone. Just gone. Matt stumbled forward, almost falling into the fire. He spun around, wild-eyed, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Where? Then it was behind him. I barely had time to shout before it reached out. A hand, too long, too thin, brushed against Matt's shoulder. He let out a strangled cry and whirled around, slashing with his knife. Again, nothing. Just empty air. And then the whispering started. Not from one place. From everywhere. Low. Hushed. Impossible to make out. But the message was clear. Leave. Get out. Now. Nate grabbed my arm. His face was pale, his mouth moving soundlessly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. We need to go. I nodded. Matt was shaking. His knife was still in his hand, but I could see his fingers trembling. The firelight flickered again, harder this time, almost going out. And in that split second of darkness, I saw them. Not one, not two, dozens, all standing in the tree line, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Run! It wasn't a suggestion. It was the only option. We turned and bolted for the tents. Nate fumbled with the zipper, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get it open. Matt grabbed his backpack, his breathing ragged. Then the laughter started again. Not just one voice. Many. Too many. It echoed through the trees, surrounding us, coming from all sides. Some of the voices sounded high-pitched, others deep and guttural, but they all had the same hollow, unnatural quality. The fire went out. Everything plunged into darkness. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything except my own breath, ragged and panicked. I reached out, my fingers finding the rough fabric of the tent. Then the footsteps started. Fast, too fast, and they were coming straight for us. We ran. No hesitation, no second guessing, just pure survival instinct. My feet barely felt the ground as we sprinted through the darkness, dodging trees, jumping over roots, the cold air slicing through my lungs. Behind us, the footsteps grew louder, impossibly fast, moving in ways that no human could. Nate tripped. I heard the thud, his sharp gasp as he hit the ground hard. Without thinking, I skidded to a stop, grabbing his arm and hauling him up. "Come on, move." His face was twisted in pain, but he didn't argue. He staggered forward, barely able to keep up. Matt was already ahead, his flashlight swinging wildly in his grip, illuminating the narrow trail that led back to the main road. We just had to make it to the car. The laughter followed us. It wasn't coming from behind us anymore. It was everywhere. Above, below, right next to my ear, even though nothing was there. And then the trees started closing in. Not literally, but it felt like they were. The path, which had been cleared just a few minutes ago, suddenly felt suffocating, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, shadows shifting unnaturally. Every step felt slower, heavier, like something was trying to pull us back. My vision blurred from the sweat and panic, but I could see the road ahead. Just a little farther. Just a few more steps. Then Matt screamed. It wasn't a yell of frustration. It was raw, primal terror. I turned, my flashlight catching the moment his legs were swept out from under him. He hit the ground hard, skidding on the dirt. I ran to him, but before I could reach him, something yanked him backward into the trees. Gone? Just gone. I stopped breathing. My mind refused to process what he'd just seen. Nate grabbed my arm, his voice barely audible. "We have to." Then Matt came back. Or, at least, something that looked like Matt. He stood at the edge of the tree line, his posture too stiff, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His head tilted just slightly to the left, his mouth slightly open. Then he spoke. "Why are you running?" I nearly dropped my flashlight. The voice was his. But the way it came out, flat, empty, like someone repeating words they didn't understand, made my stomach turn. Nate took a step back, dragging me with him. "Matt?" The thing smiled. And that was the last straw. We turned and ran. The car was just ahead, parked right where we'd left it. I nearly ripped the door handle off trying to get inside. Nate barely had time to jump into the passenger seat before I turned the key. The engine sputtered. No, not now. I twisted the key again, slamming my foot on the gas. The headlights flickered on, casting beams of light into the woods. Matt was still standing there, watching. Then the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the car into drive and tore down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep control of the wheel. Nate was staring straight ahead, breathing hard, his face pale. Neither of us spoke. The laughter had stopped. The road stretched ahead of us, winding down the mountain, leading back to civilization. It should have felt safe. But it didn't. Because as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something standing in the road behind us. Not Matt. Not anything human. Just a shape. A dark, impossibly tall shape. Watching. Waiting. And even though we were miles away within minutes, I swear I could still hear the whispering. The highway felt unreal, like stepping into another world after escaping something that shouldn't exist. The glow of streetlights, the occasional distant headlights of other cars, the hum of civilization. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence in the car was thick, heavy, pressing down on us. My hands were still gripping the wheel too tightly, my knuckles white. My pulse hadn't slowed. The tension in my chest hadn't eased. Finally, Nate exhaled a shaky breath. "We're not talking about this." I nodded. Agreed. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't something we could just forget, no matter how much we wanted to. It wasn't just a bad night in the woods. It wasn't just fear getting the best of us. Matt was gone. That wasn't something we could ignore. The drive home felt endless. Every shadow on the side of the road made my stomach tighten. Every movement in my peripheral vision sent a jolt of panic through my body. Even in the safety of my car, the rational part of my brain told me it was over, but the rest of me wasn't convinced. I dropped Nate off at his apartment. He hesitated before getting out of the car, his hand on the door handle. "You gonna be okay?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure. "Yeah," I lied. He didn't believe me, but he didn't press. He just nodded, then stepped out, closing the door behind him. I watched him disappear into his building, waiting until the door shut behind him before I drove off. When I finally made it home, I locked every door, checked every window, kept the lights on. Sleep didn't come easy. When I finally drifted off, it didn't last long. Because at 3:12 a.m., I woke up suddenly, heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent, still, but something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The whispering. Not loud, not close, but there, somewhere outside my window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I never went back to that forest, never looked into what happened that night. Because deep down, I knew some things aren't meant to be understood. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to share a story like this. Ghost stories, urban legends, unexplained mysteries, they were always just entertainment to me, nothing more. I was the guy who would roll his eyes at those real-life horror stories people shared online. I figured people just had wild imaginations, or they wanted to make something mundane seem more interesting. But after what happened to me last fall, I don't look at the world the same way anymore. At the time, I was working a job I didn't really care for. It paid the bills, and that was good enough. I handled inventory for a small distribution company that operated out of a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places that used to be something bigger, a factory, maybe, back when industry was still booming. But by the time I worked there, the main facility had shut down. The warehouse was just a small operation running out of one of the remaining buildings. The rest of the property was abandoned, fenced off, and supposedly scheduled for demolition. There were only a few of us on the night shift, just enough to keep things running. Most nights were quiet. We'd clock in, go through shipments, check inventory logs, and spend way too much time staring at the clock, waiting for our shift to end. The air in that place always felt heavy, like it was pressing down on you. At first, I blamed it on the dust and the stale, recycled air from the ventilation system, but after a while, I started to feel like there was something else. It wasn't just the building itself that felt off, it was the location. The factory was in the middle of nowhere, with only a long, empty road leading up to it. No houses, no stores, no traffic, just the remains of a once thriving industrial area that had been left to rot. If you stood outside at night, it was too quiet. No wind, no distant highway noise, nothing. Just silence stretching out into the dark. The guys I worked with didn't seem to care. They were used to the place and had their own ways of killing time. Some brought portable gaming consoles, others watched videos on their phones. Me? I usually just walked around during breaks, stretching my legs and letting my mind wander. That was my mistake. One night, I decided to step outside for some air. The warehouse had a small loading dock at the back, overlooking the deserted factory grounds. Beyond the fence, the abandoned buildings stood like hollowed-out skeletons, their broken windows staring out into the darkness. I leaned against the railing, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, faint, almost impossible to notice at first. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. Not the quick scurry of an animal, not the echo of my own movements. Someone was walking beyond the fence, just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old piece of metal shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The night was still, heavy, and the sound continued. Step, step, step. I turned off my phone screen and listened harder, trying to pinpoint the direction. The footsteps seemed to be coming from one of the old factory buildings, one that hadn't been used in years. My stomach tightened. No one was supposed to be back there. The place had been abandoned long before I started working at the warehouse, and the company didn't bother securing it beyond the rusted-out fence. I stayed there for a few more minutes, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped. Just like that, the sound was gone. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself as I walked back inside. But even after I got back to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, I kept glancing at the security monitors. Our system only covered the warehouse itself. There were no cameras pointed at the old factory. But part of me wished there were, because as I watched the grainy, black and white footage of my coworkers moving through the aisles, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. And the fact that, for the first time since I started working there, I had the strange, unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off. It was easy enough at first. After all, I hadn't seen anything. Just a sound, nothing more. Maybe an old pipe shifting in one of the buildings, or an animal stepping over broken concrete. That's what I told myself. But the feeling that something was off never quite left me. That night, as my shift went on, I found myself more aware of the silence in the warehouse. Usually, I didn't think about it, just the hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional creak of metal shelving, the distant voices of my coworkers joking around. But after hearing those footsteps outside, it was like my brain was tuned into every little noise. The rustling of paper, the clicking of a pen against a clipboard, even my own breathing, it all felt too loud, too sharp. At around 2 in the morning, I decided to step outside again. Not for a break this time, but to check. Maybe to prove to myself that there was nothing out there. The loading dock was empty. The metal railing was cold under my hands as I leaned against it, staring out at the fenced-off remains of the old factory. The moon was out, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement and rusted structures. I waited, listening. Nothing. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a shadow moving in one of the factory's broken windows. It wasn't much, just the faintest shift in the darkness. But it was enough. My fingers clenched the railing. I wasn't alone. I turned to head back inside, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached for the door, I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow. Measured. This time, they weren't distant. They were closer. My breath caught. The footsteps weren't coming from inside the factory. They were on the pavement, just beyond the fence. I forced myself to turn around, scanning the darkness. I saw nothing. Just the same empty lot, the same dead buildings. But the sound kept coming. Footsteps, approaching the fence, stopping just at the edge of the light. I took a step back, gripping the door handle. My body tensed as I stared at the fence, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the shadows. But nothing did. The footsteps stopped. And then, after a long, terrible moment of silence, I heard something new. A breath. It was faint, just barely there, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the fence, breathing, watching me. I yanked the door open and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears as I locked it, my fingers feeling unsteady. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. No one else seemed to notice. My coworkers were still going about their routines, moving pallets, scanning barcodes, joking with each other like nothing was wrong. I felt like I was in a different world, like I had just brushed against something I wasn't supposed to. I told myself I wouldn't go back outside, not for the rest of the shift. But the feeling didn't leave me. Even as I tried to focus on work, I kept glancing toward the back of the warehouse. I kept listening. And then, about an hour later, something even worse happened. I was working in one of the back aisles, scanning boxes, when the warehouse lights flickered. It wasn't unusual, old wiring, I figured. But then I noticed something strange. The emergency exit at the far end of the warehouse had a small window in the door. Just a tiny square of reinforced glass. And as the lights flickered, I saw it. A figure. It was standing just outside the door. I froze, my body going rigid. The figure wasn't moving. Just standing there, barely visible through the dirty glass. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, the figure was gone. My stomach dropped. I hurried toward the main part of the warehouse, trying to keep my breathing steady. I wasn't about to go check. I wasn't about to open that door. I found one of my coworkers and forced a laugh. "Hey, you ever seen someone out by the emergency exit?" He gave me a weird look. "What?" "No, why?" I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Thought I saw something." He just shook his head. "Dude, no one comes out here." "You know that. It's dead out there." "Yeah, I knew that. And that's what scared me." I spent the rest of my shift trying to stay busy, trying to keep my mind off it. But every time I glanced toward the back of the warehouse, I felt that same pressure, that same awareness. Like something was waiting. Like something was watching. And the worst part, I had the sinking feeling that whatever it was, it wasn't planning to leave. I didn't tell anyone. Not really. I mentioned it in passing, something about the emergency exit, maybe a drifter hanging around, but I could tell by the way my coworkers looked at me that they didn't take it seriously. I didn't blame them. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined it. That's what I kept telling myself. But then, things got worse. The footsteps returned. The next night, I was back at work, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my chest. I told myself it was just one weird incident, a shadow, a trick of the light, nothing more. But as the hours passed, I started to notice little things. The footsteps returned. At first, they were distant, barely audible beneath the hum of the warehouse machinery. But as the night dragged on, they grew louder, closer. I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. One moment, they sounded like they were near the loading dock. The next, they were by the emergency exit. I tried to ignore them. I focused on stacking boxes, scanning inventory, keeping my hands busy. But the more I ignored it, the worse it got. And then, just after 3 a.m., I heard something new. A knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it came from the emergency exit door. The one where I had seen the figure the night before. I stopped what I was doing. My skin prickled as I turned my head toward the door. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. I looked around. None of my coworkers were nearby. The warehouse was vast, rows of towering shelves casting long shadows under the dim lights. If I called for someone, I wasn't sure if they'd hear me. I took a step closer to the door, my heart pounding. Through the small window, all I saw was darkness. No figure, no movement. Just an empty lot beyond the fence. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me not to open the door, not to even touch it. I backed away, forcing myself to act like I hadn't heard anything. I went back to work, but my hands were shaking. A few minutes later, the knocking stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. The warehouse camera feeds. At lunch, I finally decided to do something. The warehouse had security cameras, cheap, outdated ones, but still enough to get a grainy feed of the perimeter. I figured if there was someone out there, it'd see them on the footage. I walked into the small break room where the monitors were set up. One of the supervisors was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. I nodded at him. Hey, mind if I check something on the cameras? He barely looked up. Sure, just don't break anything. I pulled up the footage from the past few hours, fast-forwarding through the dull monotony of the night shift. The lot outside the emergency exit remained still, nothing but cracked pavement and weeds swaying in the wind. Then I reached the moment when I heard the knocking. My stomach tightened as I watched. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the door shook slightly, as if something had struck it. But there was nothing there. I rewound, played it again. The door visibly moved, just a small jolt, but the camera didn't show anyone standing outside. I felt my breath catch. That wasn't possible. I checked another camera, the one facing the factory ruins beyond the fence. The timestamp matched. I let the footage play, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A shadow, not a person, not an animal, just a shape, darker than the rest of the night, shifting near one of the broken windows of the abandoned factory. It didn't move like a person would. It flickered, almost like it was glitching, vanishing and reappearing closer to the fence. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. I wasn't imagining this. I turned to my supervisor. Hey, come look at this. He sighed, putting his phone down and walking over. I replayed the footage, pointing to the shadow. He squinted at the screen. What am I looking at? There, near the fence. It moved. He stared for a moment, then shrugged. Looks like a camera glitch. These things are old. No, man, watch it again. I replayed it. This time, as the shadow flickered closer, I swear I saw something that looked like legs. My supervisor rubbed his eyes. "You're working too many night shifts." He grabbed a soda from the fridge and sat back down. "Go take a break or something." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him I wasn't just seeing things. But I knew he wasn't going to believe me. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep watching. The whispered name. That night, I was extra careful. I didn't go near the emergency exit. I stayed in well-lit areas. I kept my head down, pretending everything was normal. But it didn't matter. At around 4 a.m., I was alone in one of the aisles, moving boxes, when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, almost impossible to hear over the warehouse noise. But I knew it was real. Someone whispered my name. My whole body went cold. I spun around. Nothing. The aisle stretched out in both directions, empty. No coworkers, no movement. I took a step back, my throat dry. Then I heard it again. Closer. My name. Barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. I dropped the scanner I was holding and bolted toward the main area of the warehouse. My heart was racing. I didn't stop until I saw one of my coworkers by the loading dock. He gave me a weird look. "Dude, what's wrong with you?" I forced a laugh. "Nothing. Just thought I heard something." He shook his head. "You're freaking yourself out, man." Maybe. But I knew what I heard. And whatever it was, it knew my name. The silent figure. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. I clocked out, grabbed my bag, and headed toward the employee parking lot. The night air was cold. The warehouse lights cast long shadows across the pavement. I just wanted to get to my car and go home. But as I reached my car, I felt it again. That terrible, suffocating feeling. I turned my head, and I saw someone standing by the fence. A figure, motionless. It was just beyond the reach of the security lights, too far to make out any details. But I knew it was watching me. I stood there, my keys in my hand, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, slowly, the figure took a step back. And another. And then, it was gone. Just like that. Like it had never been there. I didn't wait. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and tore out of the parking lot as fast as I could. I told myself I wouldn't come back, that I'd quit, find another job. But I knew that wasn't realistic. I had bills to pay, and I had a feeling that whatever was happening wasn't done with me yet. I didn't want to turn around. Every part of me screamed that whatever was behind me was not something I was meant to see. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought about running, bolting straight through the factory doors and never looking back. But something kept me frozen in place. Then I heard a low, raspy breath, not mine, just inches behind me. I spun around, my flashlight struggling against the suffocating darkness, casting jagged, broken beams across the abandoned machinery. My stomach clenched. There, in the dim glow, something shifted, something tall, with impossibly long limbs, hunched over as if it had been standing just behind me. I could see the outline, a shape that shouldn't exist, its body elongated, unnatural. The second my light touched it, it jerked backward with an inhuman twitch, vanishing into the shadows between the rusted machines. My breathing was ragged, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I stepped back, my shoes crunching on the scattered debris. I knew I had to get out, but my body wouldn't move. My ears strained, listening for any sign of movement. The factory was silent again, too silent. The kind of silence that makes your bones feel cold. Then, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But no, this was different. A murmur, soft and uneven, like someone trying to form words but failing. The sound slithered through the factory, echoing off the metal beams, growing louder, closer. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam flickered violently, as if something was interfering with it. Then, the machinery, dead for years, groaned. A rusted conveyor belt screeched, moving an inch before stopping. A heavy chain, hanging from the ceiling, swung slightly, as if someone had just brushed past it. My eyes darted between the shadows, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, feet. A pair of bare, filthy feet stepped into the edge of my light, just visible beneath one of the machines. The toes curled against the concrete, pressing down as if testing the ground. My throat tightened, and I took a shaky step back. The feet moved. Slowly, a body unfolded from the darkness, rising unnaturally, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The figure was impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over jagged bones. Its head tilted too far to one side, as though its neck had been broken. I wanted to run. I should have run. But my legs were led, and all I could do was watch as it took another step forward, its body twitching, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispering grew louder, turning into something resembling a desperate plea. "Don't go," it rasped. I stumbled back, finally breaking free from whatever force had held me in place. My flashlight flickered violently, plunging me into near darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned and ran, my footsteps slamming against the concrete floor. But the factory wasn't done with me. Behind me, something crashed, loud, metallic. The sound of twisting metal, of something enormous shifting in the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just sprinted toward the doorway, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. Then, just as I reached the entrance, a new sound cut through the air. Laughter. Low, dry, almost choking. It came from everywhere, echoing through the walls, seeping into my skin. The thing in the shadows wasn't just watching, it was amused. I hit the door at full force, shoving it open and stumbling out into the night. The air outside was sharp and cold, but I didn't stop running. I didn't dare stop until I was far, far away from that factory, the laughter still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop running. The factory's crumbling walls disappeared behind me as I sprinted down the cracked pavement, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. My flashlight bounced wildly in my grip, its beam flickering across the overgrown weeds and rusted fences. I knew I was out. I had made it beyond those cursed walls, but something felt wrong. The night air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing against me, refusing to let me escape completely. The laughter was gone, but its echo was still in my head, twisting in my thoughts. I forced myself to keep moving, refusing to look back, even though every instinct screamed that something was still behind me. When I finally reached my car, parked at the edge of the abandoned lot, I fumbled for my keys with trembling fingers. My pulse pounded in my skull, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I had lost them. But then, metal against metal. Relief flooded me as I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and locking it in one frantic motion. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, trying to slow my breathing. The factory loomed in the distance, barely visible through the windshield. I should have felt safe. I was out. I was in my car. But something still didn't feel right. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine stuttered, coughed. Then it died. My stomach clenched. I tried again. Click. Nothing. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. My car had never had issues before. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I pressed the power button, the screen stayed black. No response. Dead. A thick silence settled over everything, heavier than before. I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. The factory door was open. I knew, without a doubt, I had left it shut. The space beyond it was nothing but darkness. An open mouth, waiting. Then, movement. My breath hitched as something shifted just beyond the threshold. A shape barely visible in the shadows. It was standing there, watching. I turned the key again, harder this time. The engine groaned, sputtered, then roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. As I sped backward, my headlights swept across the entrance. It was gone. The figure, the thing, vanished. But I knew it was still there. I didn't stop to question it. I didn't care about what had just happened. I only knew I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. I hit the main road and drove. My hands were tight on the wheel, my body still shaking, my mind racing. Every streetlight that passed over my windshield felt like a pulse of safety, a reminder that I was back in the real world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. When I finally made it home, I parked in my driveway and just sat there, my hands still gripping the wheel. My breathing was steadier now, but the unease hadn't faded. The whole night felt unreal, but I knew it had happened. I could still feel the factory's suffocating air on my skin. I forced myself to move, to step out of the car and into the familiar comfort of my house. I locked every door behind me, checking them twice, 3 times. Then I sat in my living room, every light in the house on, my back pressed against the couch. I told myself it was over. But then, a sound. Faint, distant. Footsteps. Somewhere outside. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, my breath locked in my chest. The sound had been distant, maybe the sidewalk, maybe my driveway, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wanted to tell myself it was just someone walking by, a late-night jogger, a neighbor taking out the trash. But my street was quiet, and at this hour, no one should have been out there. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't dare move. The only sound was the hum of my living room lamp, casting a weak, yellow glow over the walls. My eyes were locked on the front door, my ears straining for anything, a shuffle, a breath, anything. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just shaken, my nerves playing tricks on me. The night had been long, terrifying, and my mind was still clawing for an explanation. I forced myself to stand, legs unsteady, and made my way to the window. The street was empty. No one was there. The factory was miles away, locked behind rusted fences and forgotten by the world. I was home. I was safe. But I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to push it all away. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in an eerie, abandoned building. That the footsteps, the laughter, the figure, none of it was real. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I had scared myself with my own paranoia. But then I saw it. As I stepped outside, locking my door behind me, my eyes flicked down to the porch. There, just at the edge of the welcome mat, a single, dirty footprint pointed toward my door. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. The logical part of my mind screamed for an explanation. Maybe I had tracked something in last night. Maybe it was an old mark I hadn't noticed before. But deep down, I knew. I hadn't imagined it. Something had followed me, and it knew where I lived. I scrubbed the footprint away, but it didn't erase the feeling. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. At home, at work, even just walking down the street. The air felt heavier, like I had brought something back with me. I never told anyone the full story. What would I even say? That something from an abandoned factory had followed me home, that I had heard laughter in the dark, that a shadow had stood in my rearview mirror. No one would believe me, but I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what waited for me in the darkness of that factory. But I know one thing. Some doors, once opened, never really close. And some footsteps never stop following you. For the past few years, I've been part of a small group investigating abandoned locations. It's not a profession, not exactly, but a passion. Some do it for the history, others for the adrenaline. Me? I did it to chase that feeling of unease, that primal part of us that tells us something isn't right. This story takes place in 2017 in a forgotten prison on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. The prison had been shut down in the early 90s after a series of violent incidents, riots, unsolved deaths, and rumors of corruption that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. It was the kind of place where men went in and never came out, whether they served their time or not. That night, it was just three of us, me, my best friend Eric, and his older brother, Todd. We had been planning this investigation for weeks. Todd had managed to pull some strings and get us access for the night. It wasn't exactly legal, but as long as we didn't break anything or get caught, no one cared. The prison sat at the end of a long, cracked road, surrounded by nothing but dead trees and overgrown fields. The sky was heavy with clouds, blotting out the stars, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and old stone. The kind of night where sound carries just a little too well. We parked outside the main gates, the massive iron doors rusted shut. The only way in was through a side entrance, one that had been pried open long ago by vandals. We stepped inside, the air immediately cooler than outside, and the silence was deafening. The first thing that hit me was the smell, damp concrete, mildew, and something else beneath it. Something stale and wrong. The walls were lined with rusted bars, each cell a tiny box of decay. The floors were littered with debris, old papers, broken furniture, pieces of the past left behind. Todd led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Cell block B should be straight ahead, he muttered, checking the map we had printed from old blueprints. That's where we wanted to focus. The reports we had read, mostly from old guards, mentioned strange noises, voices, and sometimes something worse. Eric was already filming, his camera's night vision glowing in the darkness. "You guys feel that?" he asked. I did. The air was heavier here. It pressed down on my chest, not in a way that made it hard to breathe, but in a way that told me we weren't alone. We moved deeper into the prison, past the cafeteria, past the old warden's office, and finally, we reached cell block B. The long hallway stretched into the darkness, rows of cells on either side. Some had doors still closed, others hung open like yawning mouths. The metal catwalk above creaked softly, even though no one was walking on it. "This is it," Todd said, his voice low. Eric set up the recording equipment while I ran a quick EVP session. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some faint interference, the usual static. But the second I pressed record, the temperature dropped, and the recorder crackled with an odd distortion. We exchanged glances. None of us spoke. None of us moved. Then, from the far end of the hallway, there was a sound. A whisper, barely audible. A breath against the silence. And then, footsteps. Slow, measured, coming straight toward us. The moment those footsteps started, every hair on my body stood on end. They weren't rushed or hesitant, just a steady, deliberate pace coming down the cell block, like someone was making their rounds. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam trembling slightly as I turned toward the source of the sound. The others did the same, but all we could see was the long stretch of darkness ahead, lined with rusted cell doors. Eric adjusted his camera, the green glow of night vision illuminating his face. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said. "It was footsteps." Todd exhaled sharply. "Could be an animal." But we all knew that wasn't it. No animal moved like that, slow, deliberate, like it had purpose. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step forward. My boots scraped against the grimy floor, the sound far too loud in the thick silence. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, and the deeper we went, the colder it got. We reached the end of the row, where a large, rusted security gate stood partially open. Beyond it, the hallway continued into the maximum security wing, where the worst of the worst had been kept. Todd tried to push the gate open further, but it wouldn't budge. "Locked," he muttered. "No way anyone's been back here." And yet, the footsteps had been coming from this direction. Eric glanced down at his camera. "Guys, the battery just drained." I turned toward him. "What?" He flipped the camera around to show us the screen. Full battery when we walked in. Now, completely dead. "That's not normal," Todd said. I felt it too. A shift in the air, like something had changed. The silence wasn't just empty anymore. It was watching. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to push the unease down. We turned back toward the row of cells. The metal catwalk above groaned softly again, though none of us had stepped on it. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the cell doors, number B13, was slightly ajar. It hadn't been that way when we walked past earlier. I knew because I had looked directly at it, making a mental note of how rusted shut it was. "Did one of you touch that?" I asked. Todd shook his head. "No." Eric raised his dead camera like it would somehow capture what we were seeing. "That door was closed." I stepped forward, gripping the edge of the door with one hand. It felt ice cold. When I pushed, the metal groaned and resisted, like something was holding it in place. I had to put my shoulder into it to get it to move even an inch further. And then, from inside the cell, there was a sound. A single, sharp knock. We froze. It came from deep within the darkness of the tiny cell. 3 of us standing outside, and someone inside. My throat tightened. "Hello?" "Silence!" The knock had been deliberate. Not an accidental shift of old metal, not something falling. It had been responsive. Todd clenched his jaw. "We need to keep recording." Eric fumbled with his backup camera, flipping it on. The red recording light glowed in the dimness as he aimed it at the cell. "If someone's in there, say something." Nothing. The air inside the cell seemed darker than it should have been. Even with our flashlights beaming in, the far corner remained hidden in shadow. And then, just as Eric took a step closer, a whisper cut through the silence. It was low, raspy, just a single word. "Leave!" Eric stumbled back so fast he nearly dropped his camera. "No, no, no." Todd pulled me away from the cell as well. We're not alone in here. I turned back, my heart hammering. The cell door, B13, was slowly swinging shut. On its own. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent a shiver through me. The door was heavy, rusted, stiff with time. But it was moving, closing itself as if something inside was making sure we didn't come any closer. Eric's breathing was ragged. That's not possible. We took a few more steps back, our flashlights now jittering across the walls. The prison felt tighter, like the very air had thickened around us. Todd, ever the skeptic, exhaled hard. It could be a draft. But before he could finish, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the hall. Fast, heavy, coming straight toward us from the direction of the security gate. We all turned at the same time, flashlights swinging wildly, trying to catch whatever was coming. Nothing. Just the empty hall, the rows of cells, the silence pressing against us. Then, another noise. A scrape. Metal dragging against stone. It was coming from above us. The catwalk. I aimed my flashlight upward, and for just a split second, I swore I saw something. A shadow, a figure. But the beam flickered, and by the time I steadied it, there was nothing. No movement. No sign that anyone had ever been there. Eric's hands were shaking as he checked his camera again. This place isn't empty. Todd nodded, his expression unusually serious. Let's go back to the main hall. We need to check the recordings. I didn't argue. None of us did. We turned and started making our way back toward the entrance, moving faster than before. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us. Watching. Waiting. And as we stepped out of cell block B, a new sound filled the prison. A slow, deliberate tapping against metal, as if something was keeping count. We didn't stop moving until we reached the main hall. Even then, the sense of unease clung to us like a second skin. The air was heavier than before, thick with something unseen but deeply felt. The prison wasn't just abandoned, it was aware of us. Eric fumbled with his equipment, setting up the laptop on a rickety wooden table covered in dust. We need to check the recordings, he muttered. His voice was shaky, and I didn't blame him. Todd stood near the entrance, arms crossed. He kept glancing back toward the hallway we had just left, as if expecting something to follow us. That door moved on its own, he said. You both saw it. I nodded, rubbing my arms against the chill. And the voice. Someone or something whispered. That wasn't a trick of the wind. Eric's fingers flew over the keyboard, loading the video files. The camera had been rolling the entire time, even when its battery mysteriously drained earlier. We crowded around the screen. The footage played back in eerie night vision, casting everything in a ghostly green glow. The moment we approached cell B13, the air on screen seemed off, like the space itself was warping. Then we heard it. The knock. Clear as day, echoing through the audio. It hadn't been our imagination. Eric paused the video. That was inside the cell. Todd exhaled slowly. Play the part where it whispered. Eric pressed play again. We listened. A few seconds of silence. Then, through the static, leave. I gritted my teeth. It was louder on the recording than we had heard in person, more guttural, more insistent. Todd's face paled slightly. That's not a normal voice. Eric rewound again, adjusting the audio levels. As he played it back, something else became clear. There had been a faint breath right before the whisper, like someone was standing right next to the microphone. Eric pushed back from the laptop. I don't like this. I wiped a hand over my face. We need to go back. Todd turned to me, eyes narrowing. What? I squared my shoulders. We came here to investigate. This place is trying to show us something. If we run now, we'll never know what's happening. Eric hesitated. then nodded reluctantly. Fine, but we stick together. Todd sighed heavily, shaking his head. You guys are insane. But he grabbed his flashlight and checked his extra camera battery anyway. The walk back down cell block B felt different this time. The air was colder. The silence wasn't just empty, it was pressing down on us, thick and suffocating. As we reached B13, I felt it before I saw it, a pulse in the air, like static electricity dancing along my skin. And then the cell door slammed shut. There's no way, Todd whispered. No way. I reached out, pressing against the door. It was locked tight, rusted into place. Then, a sound, a scraping noise. Not from the cell, from the other end of the hallway. Slow, dragging, metal against concrete. We turned in unison, flashlights cutting through the darkness. A cell door further down was creaking open. No wind, no explanation. Eric raised his camera. That wasn't open before. I swallowed hard. No, it wasn't. We approached carefully, the sound of our footsteps barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. The cell, B21, was wide open. Inside, the cot was overturned, the mattress shredded as if someone had clawed through it. Todd hesitated before stepping in. Jesus, what happened in here? Eric aimed the camera at the floor. Guys, look. I followed his gaze. The dirt and dust were disturbed, forming what looked like footprints. Bare feet, leading out of the cell. Eric's breathing turned shallow. Someone or something walked out of here recently. Todd ran a hand through his hair. No, that's not possible. There's no one here. Then, before anyone could respond, a new noise filled the air. A whisper. But this time, it wasn't a single word. It was a name. I couldn't make it out at first, but as it repeated, low, rasping, insistent, it became clearer. It was saying my name. I froze. Eric swung his camera toward me, eyes wide. Did you hear that? Todd nodded, his face a mask of disbelief. It said his name. The voice whispered again, stretched and distorted like it was coming through a broken radio. Then, something brushed against my arm. Not a gust of wind, not a shift in temperature. A touch, cold, clammy, real. I jerked back, my flashlight swinging wildly. Nope. Todd grabbed my shoulder, pulling me away from the cell. We're done. We're done. Eric's camera started glitching. The screen flickered, distorting the image. His breathing turned frantic. The footage, it's corrupting. Then, all the cell doors on the block rattled at once. A deafening, metallic boom. One after the other, the iron doors slammed shut like an invisible force was sealing them. Eric stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, no, no. Todd yanked me by the arm. We have to go. Now. I didn't argue. We ran. The moment we stepped out of cell block B, the doors behind us stopped rattling. But as we caught our breath in the main hall, a final sound sent ice through my veins. A single, deliberate knock. From inside B13. The knock from B13 echoed through the empty halls like a final warning. I felt it in my chest, deep and pounding, like a second heartbeat. We stood frozen in place. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then, another knock. Deliberate. Slow. Closer. Eric's camera was still glitching, flickering between frames like something was interfering with the feed. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the settings, but the screen remained distorted. Todd looked at me, his face pale under the dim glow of our flashlights. We need to leave, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to agree, because I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. A sound, not the knocking this time. A footstep, soft, dragging, just beyond the hallway. Todd turned, scanning the corridor with its light. Nothing. Just rows of rusted cell doors stretching into the darkness. Another footstep. This time from the opposite direction. We whipped around. Still nothing. It was playing with us. Toying with us. Todd's eyes widened. Are you insane? Did you not hear what just happened? We need to end this, I said. If we leave now, this thing, whatever it is, won't stop. It knows us now. It knows our names. Eric hesitated, staring at his malfunctioning camera. The fear in his eyes was undeniable, but he finally nodded. We go together. Todd let out a shaky breath and rubbed his temples. If we die, I'm haunting you first. Slowly, we retraced our steps down the hallway. The air felt heavier with every inch we covered, thick and electric. It wanted us here. B13's door was still shut. No more knocks. No more sounds. I exhaled, steadying my nerves, then reached out and pressed my palm against the rusted metal. Ice! The door was freezing. Eric raised the camera again, adjusting the focus. It's locked, right? Todd stepped beside me, placing his flashlight under his arm as he grabbed the rusted handle. Yeah, he rattled it lightly. This thing hasn't moved in decades. The moment he said that, the door swung open. By itself. The sound of metal scraping against concrete cut through the silence. A gust of icy air rushed past us, pulling us forward. Todd stumbled back. Nope. This is where I leave. But Eric was already stepping closer, camera focused on the inside of the cell. And that's when we saw it. At first, the darkness was overwhelming. Our flashlights barely penetrated the thick, suffocating black inside the cell. Then, movement. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something shifted. A figure, slouched in the corner, facing the wall. My throat went dry. Todd whispered, "That wasn't there before." The figure was motionless, completely still. A prison jumpsuit clung to its skeletal frame, tattered and covered in something dark. The number on its back was scratched out. Eric's camera feed stuttered violently. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath. I forced myself to step forward, inching my flashlight toward the figure. The closer the light got, the more details emerged. Sunken skin, twisted limbs, fingers curled inward like they had been gripping something tight before death. Then, before I could even process what I was looking at, it moved. Not like a normal person shifting. A sudden, jerking snap of its head. It turned toward us. I saw its face, or what was left of it. A gaping maw stretched wider than it should have. Its jaw hung open in an unnatural position, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Black voids where its eyes should have been. And then it spoke. The same voice from before. Ragged. Too close. It said my name again. I staggered back. The creature lurched forward. Eric screamed. Todd grabbed me by the arm, yanking me away. The cell door slammed shut. By itself. The impact was so strong that the rusted hinges groaned under the pressure. The air shifted violently, sucking inward toward the cell, as if the thing inside had pulled the oxygen from the room. Then, for a single, unbearable moment, silence! Nothing. No breathing. No movement. Then, the whispers started again. But now, they were coming from everywhere. From the empty cells. From the walls. From the floor beneath us. Dozens of voices, overlapping. Some shrill, some deep and guttural. Some crying, some laughing. Todd's voice broke. Run. We ran. Through the corridor. Past the empty cells. Toward the main hall. The prison was alive. Cell doors slammed on their own as we passed. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision. The whispers turned into screams. Eric tripped, barely catching himself. His camera hit the ground, the lens cracking. But he didn't stop. None of us did. We burst into the main hall, gasping for air. Then, the lights flickered. The dim glow from our flashlights barely held against the growing darkness pressing in. And then, boom! The entire building shook. A deafening crack rippled through the ceiling, dust and debris raining down. Eric turned back, chest heaving. It's trying to keep us here. I grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the exit. Move! We barreled through the doors, sprinting down the corridor leading outside. The second we crossed the threshold, the air changed. The weight lifted. The whispers stopped. The prison stood behind us, silent once more. The only sound was our ragged breathing. Todd bent over, hands on his knees, shaking his head. We should never have come here. Eric turned his broken camera in his hands, eyes distant. The footage. I looked back at the prison one last time. The door to cell block B was still open, but standing just inside the threshold was a figure, motionless, watching us. Then it turned and walked back inside. The door shut. The prison went quiet. I felt something in my chest, something heavy and unfinished, like the place was waiting, watching. And somehow I knew this wasn't over. We stood there, gasping for air in the cold night, our breath coming out in ragged, uneven bursts. The prison loomed behind us, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. No one spoke at first. Todd was hunched over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Eric clutched his broken camera, staring at the shattered lens like it held all the answers we had come looking for. And me? I just stood there, staring at the entrance to cell block B. The figure was gone. The door had closed. But something inside me knew we weren't alone. The weight in the air was gone, but the feeling it left behind wasn't. Todd finally straightened up, wiping the sweat from his forehead. We're never doing that again. His voice was shaky, raw. Eric shook his head slowly, his face still pale under the dim glow of the streetlights from the parking lot. That wasn't just. He stopped, swallowed hard. That wasn't just a haunting. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I kept staring at the prison, half expecting the doors to burst open, for that thing in B13 to come running out after us. But nothing happened. It remained silent, as if it had never woken up in the first place. After a moment, Eric turned his camera over in his hands. The footage, he muttered. We need to check the footage. Todd's eyes snapped toward him. Are you insane? We need to get out of here. Eric ignored him, already crouching down to his backpack, pulling out his laptop. His hands were shaking as he connected the camera to the device, opening the files. I didn't stop him. I wanted to see it too. The screen flickered as the first video played. The familiar sight of us walking through the entrance, joking, laughing, flashed on the screen. It was strange, watching us before everything happened. Then, the first knock from B13 played. My stomach twisted. It sounded so much worse on playback. Louder, like it was right next to the mic. Eric fast-forwarded, his breath hitching when we reached the moment the cell door swung open by itself. On the screen, our flashlights trembled as we pointed them toward the figure inside the cell. And then we saw it. The thing in B13. It was clearer on video than it had been in person. Its face was more defined, stretched and unnatural, its jaw unhinged, wider than a human should be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when we heard its voice again. Through the speakers, through the recorded footage, it said my name. Clear, sharp, deliberate. My body locked up. My hands went cold. Todd took a step back, shaking his head. No, no, he gestured to the laptop. That's not possible. Eric's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. It wasn't interference, he whispered. It wasn't just a trick of the mic. I forced myself to watch as the footage kept playing. The moment the figure lunged at us, the moment the door slammed shut on its own, the moment the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. Then, something new, something we hadn't noticed before. As we ran, the camera caught something in the hallways. Something moving. Multiple things. Shadowed figures standing in the open cells, watching us. Not just in B13. Everywhere. My stomach turned. We weren't alone, I muttered. They were all awake. Eric slammed the laptop shut. That's enough. Silence fell between us. The wind had picked up, rustling the overgrown weeds around the prison lot. Todd rubbed his face. We need to leave. Now. And this time, none of us argued. We packed up as fast as we could, throwing everything into our bags and moving toward the car. Every step felt like we were still being watched. Even as we climbed in, as the engine roared to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. We sped down the dirt road leading back to town, headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the empty countryside. No one spoke for a long time, until Todd finally broke the silence. So, what do we do with the footage? Eric didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I looked out the window, back toward the prison, now a distant silhouette in the night. I didn't have an answer either, because something told me this wasn't over. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, the only sound the steady hum of the tires against the cracked asphalt. None of us had spoken for miles, each lost in our own thoughts. I stared out the window, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass, but all I could see was that thing in cell B13. The way it moved, the way it spoke, the way it said my name. No one should ever know your name if you've never met them before. I tightened my grip on my seatbelt, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow. Todd finally exhaled, breaking the silence. Are we going to talk about it? Eric didn't take his eyes off the road. What is there to say? Todd let out a humorless laugh. We just saw, he gestured wildly. We just saw something that shouldn't exist. We heard things we can't explain. That video footage? He shook his head. No one's going to believe us. That part, at least, was true. People like us spend so much time chasing after ghosts, looking for proof, trying to capture something undeniable. But when we finally do, what then? What do you do when you find something that shouldn't be real? I shifted in my seat. Are we posting it? Eric's grip on the wheel tightened. Todd turned in his seat, eyes narrowed. I don't think we should. That made Eric glance at him. Why? Todd hesitated, then said, because I don't think it wants us to. The words sent a chill through me. Eric let out a sharp breath. That's ridiculous. Is it? Todd shot back. It said his name, Eric. His voice was tight, controlled. It wasn't just some random EV. It wasn't static. It knew him. I swallowed hard. The truth was, I felt it too. That thing knew me. I had felt its attention lock onto me the moment we stepped into that cell. And even now, even as we put miles between us and that prison, I still felt it. That weight in my chest, that sensation of being watched. It hadn't gone away. Eric clenched his jaw, shaking his head. We came here to investigate. We got the best evidence we've ever had. Todd turned back to the front, rubbing his hands over his face. And maybe that's a bad thing. Silence filled the car again. I didn't argue, because deep down, I agreed. We pulled into Todd's driveway an hour later. The house was dark, quiet, an almost surreal contrast to what we had just experienced. Eric parked the car, but no one moved. We just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled down. Todd sighed. I don't think I can sleep tonight. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:12 a.m. Me neither. Eric finally spoke. I'll check the footage again tomorrow. We'll decide what to do then. None of us responded. One by one, we climbed out of the car, slamming the doors behind us. The night was still, too still. As I stepped toward my own car, something made me hesitate. That same feeling, that awful, gut-wrenching sense of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head toward the tree line at the edge of Todd's yard, and my blood ran cold. A figure, standing between the trees. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. My breath caught in my throat. I could barely make out its features in the darkness, but I knew. It was the thing from B13. It had followed me. The streetlight flickered, and in that split second, it was gone. Vanished! I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Todd called my name. I jumped, whipping my head toward him. He was standing by his front door, eyebrows furrowed. You okay? I looked back toward the trees. Empty. The night stretched on, silent and undisturbed. I forced a shaky breath. Yeah. Todd lingered for a moment before nodding. Get some rest, man. I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I listened. I listened for whispers, for knocks, for anything. But the only sound was the clock ticking on my nightstand. Yet the feeling remained. That heavy, suffocating weight. Like something was still watching me. Waiting. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This story takes me back to a time I don't talk about often, a time that still keeps me up at night when my mind drifts too far into the past. It was supposed to be just another harmless adventure, something thrilling to shake up the monotony of everyday life. But what we experienced that night, what I saw, changed the way I see the world. It started with a simple idea. There was an old abandoned hospital about an hour from where I lived. Everyone in town knew about it. The building had been shut down for decades, left to decay in silence. Some said it was haunted, but that was the kind of thing people always said about old places. I didn't believe in ghosts, and neither did my friends. We were just looking for a way to kill time, something different from the usual routine. I had my small group, just 3 of us, all guys in our early 20s. We had known each other since high school, bonded over late-night drives, cheap food, and our shared love for urban exploration. We had been inside old buildings before, abandoned malls, shuttered motels, forgotten factories. This hospital was just another place on our list. That night was like any other. The air was warm, thick with the scent of asphalt and distant rain. We met at my apartment before heading out, grabbing flashlights and a few bottles of water. The drive was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional joke to keep things light. None of us expected anything unusual. We were more worried about running into security or stepping on broken glass than anything supernatural. When we arrived, the hospital loomed over us like a shadow from another time. The paint had peeled from its walls, and ivy crept up the sides, reclaiming the structure piece by piece. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but a section had been bent just enough to let people slip through. I hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. Something about the air felt different, heavier. My friend nudged me, laughing. "What? Getting scared already?" I rolled my eyes and kept walking. The main entrance was boarded up, so we had to find another way, and a shattered window near the back gave us access. As I hoisted myself through, the musty scent of decay hit me, mold, dust, and something else, something metallic. I coughed and waved the air in front of me, my flashlight cutting through the dark. Inside, the silence was deafening. Our footsteps echoed down the empty halls, dust swirling in the beam of our lights. Old gurneys sat abandoned in corners, their wheels rusted stiff. The walls were covered in graffiti, some crude, some intricate, but all giving the place an eerie, lived-in feel. "This place is massive," one of my friends muttered. His voice sounded small in the emptiness. We wandered through the first floor, peering into old patient rooms. Most were empty, just peeling paint and broken ceiling tiles. A few still had rusted bed frames, their mattresses long gone. It was unsettling, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary for a place like this. Then we found the stairwell. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, a wave of cold air rushed past me. It smelled damp, almost like the air from a cave. I turned to my friends. "Basement first or top floor?" One of them grinned. "Basement. That's where the good stuff is." I shook my head, but followed them down. The metal stairs groaned beneath our weight, and for the first time that night, I felt something crawl up my spine. I brushed it off as nerves. It was just an empty building, nothing more. Or so I thought. The stairs creaked under our weight as we made our way down, each step echoing in the silence. The deeper we went, the colder it became. By the time we reached the basement level, it felt like we had stepped into a completely different world, one untouched by time. The air down there was thick, damp, and stale. It smelled like mildew, old metal, and something else. Something faintly sour, like the scent of a wound that had never healed. My flashlight flickered slightly, and I tapped it against my palm. "Your battery's good?" my friend asked, noticing. "Yeah, I just put new ones in," I said, shaking it off. The basement stretched out before us in a long corridor lined with doors, some marked with old, faded signs. Storage, records, morgue. Most of the doors were either locked or stuck, swollen from years of moisture. Others had been forced open by previous trespassers, revealing empty rooms filled with debris and rusting equipment. "Where do you think they kept the bodies?" one of my friends asked, half joking. "The morgue, obviously," I muttered, nodding toward the door at the end of the hall. He smirked. "Want to check it out?" I hesitated. Not because I was scared, at least, that's what I told myself, but because something about that door made my stomach turn. It was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond it. The sign above it was rusted, the letters barely legible. "We came all this way," my other friend said. "Might as well." I sighed and pushed forward, gripping my flashlight tighter. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a room bathed in thick shadows. The beam of my flashlight swept across the space, rows of empty metal drawers where bodies had once been stored. The stainless steel tables in the center were coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like untouched snow. "Nothing here," I said, feeling an odd sense of relief. Then something shifted. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound. My breath caught in my throat. "You hear that?" I whispered. My friends froze. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, from the far corner of the room, where the light barely reached, came another sound, like the soft drag of fabric against the floor. My grip tightened on my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Probably a rat," one of my friends muttered, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. I swallowed hard and took a slow step forward. The beam of my flashlight landed on the corner, illuminating nothing but an overturned chair and an old, crumbling pile of papers. But the moment I took another step, my flashlight flickered again, this time cutting out completely. I cursed under my breath, smacking it against my palm. The darkness swallowed us whole. "Guys, turn on your lights," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The beams from their flashlights clicked on, casting harsh shadows against the walls. My friend aimed his light toward the corner, but it was empty. The silence felt heavier now, like the air itself was pressing down on us. "All right, let's get out of here," I said quickly. No one argued. As we turned to leave, my friend yanked on the door handle, and it didn't budge. His flashlight wobbled slightly in his grip. It was open a second ago. "Don't mess around," I muttered, reaching past him to pull it myself. The handle was ice cold, but it didn't move. Another sound, this time closer. A soft tap, tap, tap against the far wall. We all turned at the same time, our flashlights scanning the room. The walls were bare, cracked from years of neglect. There was nothing there. And then, just as suddenly as it had stuck, the door swung open with a low groan. We stumbled out into the hallway, our breaths coming faster than before. None of us spoke. We didn't have to. We all knew something was off now. I wanted to leave, to go back up those stairs and never look back, but my friends were already moving toward another room. And for some reason, one I still don't understand, I followed. I followed them down the hallway, though every instinct told me to turn back. My stomach felt tight, my skin was clammy, and the cold that hung in the air had settled deep in my bones. Something was wrong. The silence in the basement had changed. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It felt alive, like something was listening, waiting. The three of us walked in single file now, our flashlights slicing through the darkness, creating long, shifting shadows along the cracked walls. "Which room are we checking next?" my friend asked, his voice low. "The records room," the other said. "There might be something cool in there." I wasn't sure what counted as cool in a place like this, but I didn't argue. We stopped in front of the old wooden door, its paint peeling away in long strips. The rusted handle turned easily under my grip, and the door groaned open, revealing rows of overturned filing cabinets and scattered papers. The air inside was heavy with dust, and as our flashlights moved across the room, I could see motes of it floating in the air, disturbed by our arrival. The smell of old paper, mildew, and something faintly metallic filled my nostrils. We stepped inside cautiously, our footsteps crunching on broken glass and crumpled pages. The room looked like it had been ransacked, drawers pulled from cabinets, folders torn open, the contents spilled across the floor. "What the hell happened in here?" my friend muttered, kicking at a pile of documents. "Probably other explorers," I said, though the words felt hollow. Something about the mess didn't feel random. We split up, each taking a different part of the room. My friend sifted through a pile of records near a collapsed shelf, while the other pried open one of the remaining filing cabinets. I moved toward a desk near the far wall, its surface covered in dust. My fingers brushed across the old wood, and something cold zipped up my spine. Then I saw it. In the dust, smeared like someone had run a hand across the surface, were the words, "Get out." I took a sharp step back, my breath catching in my throat. Guys, they looked up. I pointed at the desk. Did one of you do this? They walked over, their flashlights illuminating the words. Why would we do that? One of them asked, his voice uneasy. Maybe someone else came in here recently, the other suggested, but we all knew that wasn't true. The dust was thick. If someone had ridden it recently, we would have seen fresh footprints leading to the desk. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere down the hall, we heard it. A dragging sound. Slow, rhythmic, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. We all turned toward the doorway, our flashlights trembling slightly in our hands. What was that? No one answered. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Then, a loud bang. It came from somewhere nearby, a door slamming shut with force. The floor beneath us seemed to vibrate slightly with the impact. We bolted out of the records room, our lights swinging wildly as we scanned the hallway. Every door was exactly as we had left it. None were open. None were moving. But something was different. The air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with something I couldn't quite name. My chest felt tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. Did you see which door it was? One of my friends asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I admitted, but it was close. We stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Then, as if the building itself was answering our hesitation, the dragging sound started again. This time, it was closer. We moved. Fast. Our footsteps echoed down the hallway as we rushed back toward the stairs, but the moment we reached them, we stopped cold. The door at the top of the staircase, the one we had come through, was shut. I knew, without a doubt, that we had left it open. Try it, my friend urged. I ran up the steps, 2 at a time, reaching for the handle. It was locked. I rattled it, yanked it, shoved my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. Guys, I said, panic creeping into my voice. My friend joined me, twisting the handle violently. This doesn't make any sense. Then we heard the whisper. It wasn't clear, just a faint, breathy murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My skin prickled. My mouth went dry. Then all the lights went out. Pitch black darkness swallowed us whole. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I fumbled with my flashlight. My hands were shaking. I clicked the switch over and over, but nothing happened. The whispers grew louder. Then, in the darkness, something moved. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't the dragging sound. It was breathing. Slow, labored, right next to us. I could feel it, could almost sense the weight of something standing too close. The air was colder now, so cold it burned. Then, from the bottom of the stairs, there was a noise. A low, wet gurgle. I don't know which one of us moved first. Maybe it was all at the same time. But suddenly, we were running. I couldn't see where we were going, only that we were moving away from whatever it was at the bottom of the stairs. We stumbled blindly through the dark, feeling along the walls, bumping into old equipment and overturned furniture. Somewhere behind us, the breathing continued. Steady, patient. Then, a hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed, yanking myself free, and suddenly my flashlight flickered back to life. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking as I pointed it in every direction. There was no one there. My friends' flashlights blinked back on as well, their faces pale, wide-eyed. We didn't say a word. We just ran. Straight into the heart of the hospital. We ran. No direction, no plan, just the primal instinct to get away. The hallways stretched endlessly, twisting and turning, their peeling walls narrowing as if the building itself wanted to keep us inside. Our flashlights flickered in and out, sputtering like they were struggling against something unseen. Every step we took felt like we were being pulled deeper into a nightmare. Behind us, the breathing followed. Slow, measured, inhuman. We turned a corner, barely avoiding colliding with a rusted gurney, and skidded to a stop. A dead end. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun around. The hallway we had just come from was swallowed in darkness, an abyss of pitch black. The sound of our ragged breaths filled the air, our bodies trembling as we tried to process what was happening. Then came the whisper. Low, deliberate. This time, it was clear. You shouldn't be here. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't one of us. It was real. The flashlight in my shaking hands flickered violently before dying completely. My friends' lights did the same. Then, a thud. Heavy, wet, close. It came from the darkness just ahead. I grabbed my friend's wrist, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, the flashlight in my pocket, one I had forgotten I even had, clicked on by itself. The dim, yellow beam cut through the dark. And there it was, standing just feet away. A figure. It was wrong. Its limbs were stretched, too long to be human. Its skin, gray and paper thin, was pulled taut over sharp bones. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth, too wide, gaping open as if in a soundless scream. And then it moved. A slow, unnatural lurch, like it was learning how to walk. Its fingers twitched, reaching. My chest clenched, my throat locked. No one could speak. No one could breathe. Then it let out a sound. A long, guttural gurgle, like something drowning, choking, dying, and yet still alive. I didn't feel my legs move, but suddenly we were running again. It chased us. Its bare feet never touched the floor, yet its presence was crushing, suffocating, like gravity itself bent beneath its weight. We turned sharp corners, darting past collapsed walls, broken doors, endless debris. But the hospital had changed. The halls were looping, twisting back on themselves, leading us nowhere. A trap! I felt it closing in, around us, inside us. The air grew heavier, thick with something unseen but felt. The pressure in my skull was unbearable, like my own mind was turning against me. Then we saw it. A doorway at the end of the hall. Unlike everything else in this decayed ruin, it was pristine, a gleaming metal door with a red symbol painted across it. We didn't stop. We barreled toward it, yanking the handle, forcing it open. And then we fell. Not down a staircase, not into another hallway, but into nothingness. A void. For one eternal moment, I was weightless, suspended in something colder than air, heavier than stone. It wasn't darkness, it was emptiness. And then, impact! I gasped, my body slamming onto solid ground. My friends landed beside me, coughing, struggling to rise. We were in a room. White walls, bright, sterile lights. No dust, no decay. It looked like a hospital room that had never been abandoned. The scent of antiseptic and something faintly metallic filled the air. But then I saw the bed, and I stopped breathing. There was someone in it. A frail figure, wrapped in pristine white sheets. Unmoving. A breathing tube in their mouth. A monitor beside them blinking steadily. I stepped closer. My heart froze. It was me, lying there, eyes closed, skin pale, hooked up to machines I didn't recognize. I staggered back, shaking my head violently. No, 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 no. My friends stood motionless, their faces ghostly white. Then, the door behind us slammed open. We whirled around. The thing stood there. Only now it wasn't faceless. It had a mouth, a stretched, lipless grin. And in its sunken sockets, my own eyes stared back at me. A shattering scream ripped through the air, my scream. Then everything collapsed. The walls caved inward, the ceiling cracked, the floor split apart beneath our feet. The hospital was crumbling. The last thing I saw before everything turned to black was myself, eyes wide open, smiling. The moment everything collapsed, I felt it, a pull, not like falling, not like being dragged. It was like being torn apart and stitched back together at the same time. Then, nothing, silence, stillness, a void of absolute blackness. For a terrifying moment, I thought that was it, that I had ceased to exist, that whatever force had been haunting us had finally won. Then I woke up, flat on my back, cold cement beneath me. I gasped, my lungs burning as if I had been drowning and had just broken the surface. My hands clawed at the ground, my pulse hammering in my ears. I was back in the hospital corridor, the real one, the abandoned, rotting ruin we had entered. I scrambled to my feet, my body shaking violently. My friends were sprawled around me, gasping awake just as I had. Their eyes were wild, their skin deathly pale. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then I forced out a hoarse whisper. "What the hell just happened?" No one answered, because none of us knew. The hallway was silent again. No whispers, no footsteps, no flickering lights. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew. We knew. Something had changed. Something had shifted. And whatever it was still with us. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. It worked. The beam cut through the dust-heavy air. I turned in every direction, expecting to see it standing there, waiting. Nothing. "We need to get out of here," one of my friends choked out. No one argued. We ran. We didn't walk. We didn't check our surroundings. We just ran. Through the crumbling hallways, past the rusted equipment, through the gaping, empty doorways. Every turn we took, I expected to see that thing again. Expected to hear my own voice whispering back at me. But we reached the exit without incident. The moment my feet hit the dirt outside, I collapsed onto my knees, gasping for air. The night was still, the sky an empty, starless black. The hospital loomed behind us, a silent, forgotten grave. But I could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. We didn't speak as we stumbled back to the car. The moment we got inside and slammed the doors shut, a suffocating tension settled over us. No one wanted to be the first to say it. No one wanted to ask the question we all had in our heads. Had we ever really left? The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of that place, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. I refused to look in the rearview mirror, because some part of me knew if I did, I would see something standing there. Something that looked just like me. The next morning, I woke up feeling wrong, like something was off, like I had brought something back with me. I barely spoke to anyone that day. Neither did my friends. We exchanged short, nervous texts. None of us wanted to talk about it, but we felt it. Strange things started happening. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and see nothing. My reflection in the bathroom mirror felt delayed, like it took an extra second to mimic my movements. My phone would randomly light up with no notifications. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought they were in my head, a trick of exhaustion, but they weren't. I started hearing them in the dead of night, soft, breathy, right outside my bedroom door. "You shouldn't be here." That same voice. My voice. I stopped sleeping. I stopped feeling like myself. I don't know if any of us did. And then, one by one, my friends stopped talking to me. They wouldn't answer my texts. Calls went straight to voicemail. They were just gone. Like they had never existed at all. And the worst part, I couldn't even be sure they ever had. I started forgetting things. Details. Memories. Who were they? How many of us had been there? Had I even gone to the hospital at all? The more I tried to remember, the more the memories blurred, like something was rewriting my past. And then, one night, I heard it again. Not from outside my door. From my own mouth. I had been standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. The overhead light flickered. My breath felt heavy. And then, my reflection smiled. A slow, unnatural grin. And it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." That was the last night I stayed in that apartment. I packed my things and left. I drove without a destination, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that hospital. But deep down, I knew the truth. It didn't matter how far I went, because I never really left. It's been months now, maybe even longer. Time feels strange, like something stretched thin, bending in ways it shouldn't. Some nights, I wonder if I ever really left that hospital or if I just carried it with me. I moved to a different city, cut ties with everything and everyone connected to that night. At first, I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe. But safety is a lie. I still see it. In reflections, in half-lit rooms, in the corner of my eye. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A figure standing too still, watching. I don't look too long, because I know what I'll see. My own face. The voice doesn't speak to me anymore, not out loud, but it doesn't have to. I feel it. A presence inside me, twisting my thoughts, warping my memories. I try not to question what's real and what isn't, because every time I do, things slip further away. Sometimes I wake up and feel wrong, like I'm not supposed to be here. Like maybe I never made it out of that hospital at all. Or maybe I did, and something else came back in my place. I want go back. I want search for my friends. I want try to find answers, because I know there aren't any. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut. Some places don't let you leave, not completely. And some things wear your skin like it was always theirs. So if you ever find yourself standing outside an abandoned place, feeling that pull to go inside, don't. Because you might walk out, but you won't be the same. Or worse, you won't be you at all.